One of the things that I did in preparation for this talk was to read some of the histories that have been written about psychology, especially industrial psychology, and also the histories of psychology in some Canadian universities. And one of the topics that I encountered was the academic family tree, or one's intellectual ancestry. As some of you know, I did my PhD at McGill with Ed Webster, but who was his ancestors? Because this is what you have to do when you're doing one of these family trees. At the time he completed his PhD at McGill, there were two faculty members, W.D. Tate and Chester Kellogg. Both were Harvard PhDs and students of Hugo Munsterberg. Now, thesis advisors weren't as important as they have become in more recent years, so I've had difficulty. Even his son doesn't know which one was his advisor. It's most likely that he was a student of Kellogg because they shared research interests. But it doesn't really matter, fortunately, because both of them were students, both Tate and Kellogg were students of Munsterberg. And the fact that they were students of Munsterberg means that I, and anyone who was a student of mine, have Munsterberg, the very first industrial psychologist, as his or her ancestor. And of course, for those of you who know your history of psychology, Munsterberg was one of Wundt's students, and therefore we go back to the beginning of psychology, in my case, with 4 degrees of separation. 5 for those of you who are my student. And when I reflect on my early days in IO psychology, I'm struck by how much change there has been in what feels to me like a very short period of time. As I said, I did my PhD with Webster and was part of a group of students working with him on the employment interview. When I finished my thesis in 1960, before most of you were born, he said that there was no possibility of me or any other woman getting a job in personnel, as it was then called. More than 25 years later, in 85 or 86, he elaborated on that statement in an address at CPA, saying, and I quote, "Prior to World War II, the only women in the personnel field were a few former secretaries who had been asked to interview women applicants. Neither the Toronto nor Montreal personnel associations admitted women until long after the war. Not a single Montreal company would accept female interns from McGill. The American military accepted no women as psychologists during World War II, and the Canadian military accepted one, Dr. Mary Salter, for personnel work with women soldiers." So what a change there has been in human resources since then. Instead of working in industry, I would have to get an academic job. Even in universities, however, there were problems, rules about nepotism that made it difficult for my husband, Phil Bryden, and I to get jobs in the same department in most Canadian universities. And no university hired people to teach industrial psychology. All of us who had worked with Webster had to be much broader as academics and teach introductory or social psychology, tests and measurements, individual differences, and the like. And indeed, all of my teaching and much of my research in the first decade after I got my PhD was outside IO, of necessity. Unlike my peers at McGill, who never returned to IO, I was very lucky, perhaps for at least 3 reasons. First of all, the University of Waterloo had been very recently founded and was not worried about nepotism, so was willing to hire both of us. And there are, if you look around, mostly into the retirees, you'll find quite a few couples at Waterloo that date back to them. Senior administrators were simply looking for people prepared to build a new department, start offering graduate degrees, and embrace cooperative education and therefore year-round teaching. The university faced tremendous opposition from older universities for many of these outrageous ideas. And I have said in the past that this trial by fire gave us a sense of exceptionalism and a belief in ourselves that I think exists to this day. The first dean of engineering and later president, Douglas Wright, said that this lack of esteem from other institutions in the early days gave us a license to be radical in program development, the research questions we asked, and our teaching methods. That kind of attitude permitted us to develop programs such as industrial psychology that did not exist in more traditional universities, at least in Canada. One feature of the early days at Waterloo that may interest younger faculty members was the fact that the University of Waterloo was so new and still recovering from the turmoil of its founding that it had not yet written any policies regarding hiring and other aspects of academic appointments. This lack of experience in the administration resulted in all 8 of us, hired in 1963, receiving appointment letters with no termination date, interpreted a few years later as saying that we had all received tenure on appointment. All of the faculty had to advise graduate students. We admitted 25 graduate students our first year here, and most of them were older than we were, and more of them were accepted every year thereafter. My first MA graduate was Jim Miller, who went on to earn a PhD with me and later co-founded Questar, an employment assessment firm in Minneapolis. He didn't get much of an IO education from us, but his research was in the area, and that was about all any of us ever got then. The second lucky circumstance was the development of a new program in psychology at Waterloo. We were fortunate, largely, in having a creative and energetic chair in Dick Walters, who was concerned about the number of master's graduates in psychology who were working in applied settings without any appropriate training. To rectify that situation, he designed the MASC program, not me, in applied psychology, with options in counseling, educational, and industrial psych, and including a work term. The program attracted students from across the country and provided a critical mass in IO psych. The first industrial students in the program that I advised were Paul Stanley and Warren Chappell, both retired, both of whom had very successful careers in consulting. Subsequently, 2 more students, Dave Tucker and Wayne Johnson, joined the MASC program, and I reconnected with the military personnel group with which I had done my PhD thesis. Eventually, that connection led to a dozen or more military students, most at the master's level, but a few at the doctoral level as well. I mentioned that my doctoral research was on the interview, and that leads me to my third lucky circumstance. Getting subjects who are being interviewed for real jobs in this research area is difficult, and that's why I used the military for my thesis. So you can imagine what a godsend it was for me to find hundreds and later thousands of interviews taking place on campus each year. I made contact with Bert Barber, the director of cooperative education, who sold, but not without difficulty, something some of the people here that worked at the university may realize, that to persuade his staff that doing research on the interview was a good thing. That permitted my students and I to conduct research on co-op interviews and other aspects of transitioning to the workforce throughout my career. I also believe in returning the favors done for me So I have tried to help people in the co-op field with respect to research issues and providing them with ideas from IO Psych. As some of you know, I'm still struggling to examine, understand, and write about the varied effects of work experience. I was the sole faculty member in IO for a long time, except for a few years when Steve Cronshaw was here. That small faculty complement gave rise to questions about our ability to offer an IO PhD program, and as a result, for a few years, we operated a joint program with Guelph. That experience and my subsequent experience with other joint programs when I was Dean of Graduate Studies has led me to be against most joint programs for a variety of issues, including different standards, different approaches to research and teaching, and the extra work and expense of offering these programs. Finally, the department decided to provide some support, and Jay Michaela was hired in the late 80s. A few years later, Ramona Bobicel joined us, and then Doug Brown and Wendy Adair. Since then, James Beck and Winnie Shen have joined the group. Finally, there are now enough faculty who have a broad array of interests to mount a comprehensive PhD program without involving another institution. At the same time as Waterloo was establishing an IO graduate program, industrial and organizational psychology was becoming recognized by national psychology associations, but it was a very slow process. Despite the involvement of Hugo Munsterberg and others like Cattell and Bingham and Scott in the founding of the American Psychological Association in 1892, industrial psychology was not recognized by APA, and most industrial psychologists became members of the American Association of Applied Psychology. Finally, in 1945, APA and AAAP merged, and the sections of AAP became sections of APA, subsequently called divisions. Thus was Division 14 born. In 1982, the division looked for more independence from APA and was incorporated as the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. From 130 members in 1945 to 3,055 in 2012, and I haven't been able to get more recent numbers yet, is very impressive growth, though only a small percentage of them were graduates of an IO program. The situation in Canada was fairly similar, though the Canadian Psychological Association was not founded until 1939. Until then, Canadian psychologists were content with membership in APA. But with the onset of war, they realized the necessity of having an organization in Canada to represent their interests to government. Regardless of training or interest, the involvement of these psychologists in the war effort was in the application of psychology, largely industrial, what we would see as industrial aspects of it now. Indeed, one of their first achievements was the development of an intelligence test for the selection of recruits into the armed forces. As graduate students, my peers and I were astounded when the famous Donald Hebb dared to talk about intelligence testing, until we learned that he had spent most of the war, in fact, developing those same tests. Despite this early interest, however, just as with APA, industrial psychology was largely neglected after the war ended. As many of you know, the Canadian Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology celebrated its 40th anniversary last year. A panel of 12 past chairs of CSIOP reflected on their experiences, providing something of a history of IO in Canada. In any history of an organization, we must give credit to the founder. And in this case, we should all be thankful that Gary Latham had the foresight, energy, and especially charisma, for any of you who know Gary, to form a group identified as IO psychologists and attract us to joining. Gary, of course, was the first chair, and I became the second one. Those early years were spent, like those of PSYOP, in a struggle to gain credibility and more autonomy within CPA and to attract more members to the group. We wanted and eventually obtained program time at the annual convention for symposia, featured speakers, workshops, and paper sessions. Though we failed to create a division, we did become an interest group, which made us visible and resulted in more autonomy at the convention. As the years went by, many of the early challenges continued, and here I'm drawing upon the remarks of the 12 of us that spoke at CPA. We still had to work hard to sustain membership. It was necessary to provide structure to CSIOP by writing bylaws and keeping them current. We were threatened by the growth of IO programs in business schools, and more groups tried to attract IO psychologists to join, including PSYOP, but also the European Association of Work and Organizational Psychology and the Academy of Management. But there were also many achievements: the publication of a regular newsletter, the establishment of a graduate student award, guest speakers and symposia at the convention, and the creation of a website, and 2 special issues of Canadian Psychology devoted to IO Psych. Of special note is that 2 of our members have become presidents of CPA, Gary Latham and Kevin Kellaway currently. We panelists were also asked to reflect upon the challenges and opportunities for CSIOP in the years ahead. While our responses were really rather vague, the chair of the symposium managed to put our thoughts into a more articulate form. I would suggest to you that those same challenges and opportunities exist for the IO program here at Waterloo. I can do no better than read you what, in fact, our chair wrote at that time. As CSIOP enters its 5th decade, many issues require our attention. These challenges and opportunities are a chance for growth. Some are old, such as closing the academic practitioner gap, and will require us to renew our efforts to put research into practice and to ask practical and relevant questions in research. Other opportunities may be new and may reflect the spirit of the times, such as the need to build collaborative relationships with our clinical colleagues to address research and practice in areas such as the healthy workplace. Furthermore, the need to enhance our professional presence at the business table is increasingly important, as is the need to continue building our credibility. We must also work to maintain the importance of I in IO, including hiring academics in this area. Continue to ensure the importance of pardon me, I've missed this. Continue to ensure CPA's greater appreciation for our field, work with CPA on initiatives we consider important, promote IO psychology as a career option for talented psychology undergraduates, and more broadly, find creative ways to create opportunities from the Psychology Business School Division. Meeting these challenges and seizing the opportunities, I need to say, by CSIOP and the IO program here at Waterloo will require serious thought and hard work in the years ahead. So I don't think that's going to change. A good start, I would recommend, is for those who are not members of CSIOP to join and contribute to the national organization. In the 55 years since I received my PhD, I've been very fortunate to participate in the tremendous growth of IO psychology in general, but especially in Canada. I'm proud to have participated in the establishment of a strong IO program here at Waterloo, with graduates in both academic settings as well as business, government, and consulting. And I'm really very grateful to have had the opportunity to work with so many talented students, and I'm so very proud of their achievements in settings from the Maritimes to British Columbia. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pat. Do you have any questions? Do you mind using the microphone so we can record your question? Thank you.
Hi, Pat. I'm Neil Murray. I'm a lecturer in HRM. Just going back to the early days here at Waterloo, you mentioned the fact that there was no policies really related to recruitment and appointment, that type of thing. It seemed like a bit of a Wild West show at the time, did it? So
Yeah, especially in psychology. I haven't told you some of the things that one doesn't say in public, especially on video, about our early days. But some of you have heard the tales. We were all young. We were all under 30 when we started,
Yeah.
except for the chair.
and the camp was covered with mud at the time too, right?
Yeah, well, we were off campus for a lot of it over there on Phillip and Columbia.
So at what point did some administration come to bear then on the organization?
Gosh, it was a long time. And everything was gradual. Your old boss, Ernie Lucy, who was trained as in industrial relations, I guess, Neil, would be his background. He certainly brought some things to regularize, but largely for staff. Faculty were less likely to have regulations of that sort. Amazing number of policies were still being written when I was Dean of Graduate Studies in the 90s that we didn't have we didn't have written policies, but and our first president was from industry, Jerry Hagee. So, you know, we kind of operated like a company. He probably thought he could fire any one of us, you know, at a drop of a hat. And I don't know whether he tried to do that, and that's why we developed. I got a letter from him about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years after I'd started, that saying I'd been granted tenure as of September 1963. So it was a slow process, and as is very apparent, we were growing very rapidly. When we came in '63, there were 1,800 students that had been here in the '62-63 year, and it just grew by leaps and bounds. And in our department, we hired 10 people in 1965 and 10 more in '66. We never had colloquia because we had all these people coming through giving job talks. And it was, I mean, you know, normal things were wild, let alone the things that we all got into, being young. And as I've said somewhere else, that we all were having babies, and there must have been, I don't know, 20 or 40 babies born to faculty members and staff in our department. Well, 40 is an exaggeration, but then after all, given the size of the number of people in the department, it wasn't. And so there's a whole crew of kids that are the age of my kids out there that stem from. So we didn't have time to be too precise about things. Jim Miller's PhD thesis oral was in the staff room over on Phillip Street with an internal person and me and maybe somebody else sitting there chatting to him. So academic things were pretty loose too. And that was 68 or 9 that Jim's thesis was. And yeah, we were pretty loose.
Maybe one more question? Do we have one in the audience? Okay, thank you so much, Pat.